It was just past 8 on a gray October morning when the milkman found the body. A thick fog clung to the narrow lanes of Littlecote, that sleepy Sussex village which seemed immune to time. Ivy curled around weather-beaten walls, and the post-box outside the general store hadn't seen fresh paint since the coronation. But the house at the end of the lane, Ashcombe Hollow, stood apart, a red-brick Georgian structure too grand for its solitude, its upper floors wreathed in mist, its wrought-iron gates hanging askew as if memory alone kept them upright. The front door had been locked from the inside when Constable Briggs arrived. Summoned by the frantic milkman who'd glimpsed a body through the study window, he found no sign of forced entry, no broken glass, no unlatched window. The housekeeper, Mrs. Pettigrew, white-faced and trembling, said she had arrived precisely at 8 as usual and found the place deathly silent. She hadn't entered, never did. Without express invitation, the dead man was Algernon Bexley, retired solicitor, widower, and something of a recluse. He lay slumped at his desk in a posture to compose for sudden death. The study was tidy, absurdly so. No overturned chair, no blood, no marks on the neck or wrists. Only a single sheet of paper clutched in his stiffening hand. The paper bore one sentence, typed in a sharp, uneven font. I write to you from where no voice returns. Nothing else, no name, no signature. It might have been suicide. Except there was no typewriter in the house, and the forensic surgeon, a sharp-nosed man from Brighton, would later rule out natural causes or self-inflicted death. No poison, no trauma, no discernible cause at all. Bexley had, in the surgeon's dry phrase, simply ceased. When Lord Peter Wimsey arrived, summoned not by the police, but by the late Bexley's niece Miss Honoria Fielding, who had read about the death in a short column tucked away in the Morning Chronicle, the air of mystery had settled in like the Sussex mist. She met Wimsey at the rail station, a tight-lipped woman in her 40s with the posture of someone used to bad news. Her uncle had been difficult, eccentric, and brilliant, but not suicidal. It's not the death, Lord Peter, she said in a low voice. It's the letter. You see, it's not the first. He looked up from lighting his cigarette. Indeed, she nodded. He received others, 3 in all typed, all unsigned. He wouldn't tell me what they said. But he grew agitated, paranoid. He started, locking every door twice, had the chimney flue inspected for microphones, mad things like that. Did he keep the letters? He burned them? I saw him do it myself. The house was as she had described it, orderly, quiet, and deeply unnerving. Wimsey wandered through the rooms, pausing to listen to the creak of floorboards, the faint tick of a grandfather clock that seemed to breathe time rather than count it. The study was untouched since the constable had left. The letter remained in an evidence bag on the desk, still crisp, its words oddly impersonal, yet shivering with threat. I write to you from where no voice returns. The phrase lingered in Wimsey's mind like a half-remembered melody. It had the rhythm of verse, possibly Latin in origin, and a chill, sepulchral tone that didn't belong in a modern world. But there it was, delivered in courier type. He had the house searched from attic to cellar, no typewriter, nothing that could have produced that letter, and the windows had all been locked from within. At 11 o'clock that night, as Wimsey studied the letter again under lamplight, Miss Fielding returned to the study with a small bundle of papers. I found this among his legal files, she said. I thought it was a client matter, but, well, look. They were copies of old court records 30 years old bearing Bexley's signature. A criminal trial. One Edward P. Grayling, charged with the murder of his wife in 1899. Bexley had been the lead defense counsel. He was acquitted, Miss Fielding said. Not because he was innocent. Uncle Algy told me that. He got him off on a procedural error, but he always said it was a mistake, that Grayling was guilty, and that he should never have taken the case. Wimsey leaned back, fingers steepled. Interesting. What's more, she added, voice lower now, Grayling died 5 years ago, in prison. He'd been convicted of fraud later on. But that means, Wimsey murmured. He couldn't have written this letter, and yet it feels like him, doesn't it? Miss Fielding shuddered. Wimsey spent the night at Ashcombe Hollow. At 2:30, as the fire died in the grate, and the silence of the place grew oppressive, He rose and wandered again through the hall. It was then he saw the study door, ajar. He had closed it before Dot inside. The air was colder. On the desk lay a second sheet of paper, still warm. The silence beyond is louder than you think. No one had entered. No sound, no footsteps, no movement. And again, no typewriter. The ink was the same. The paper, identical to the last. The words struck with precision. Whimsy rang the police immediately. Inspector Poirot, already suspicious of the first incident, was no happier for the second. He had the place watched. Every corner searched again. The grounds swept. Nothing. They sent the second note to the same forensic topographer. Again, no match in any local registry. But it was the phrase that troubled Whimsy. Not just its tone, but its echo. Something familiar. Not literary, but personal. And then, 3 days later, the third note arrived. Not left in the house this time, but posted. Delivered to Miss Fielding's flat in London. You defended the guilty, and now the guilty defend you. It was addressed, quite specifically, to Bexley C. O. the grave. 3 typed lines, folded once. Whimsy felt a tremor of something rare and unwelcome. Not fear, exactly, but awe at a game played to a level even he couldn't immediately parse. How did the killer gain entry? How did they vanish? Who had motive after all these years, and who possessed the theatrical flair to stage a murder in such ghostly silence? It was a puzzle, but in the chill air of Sussex and in the dead man's quiet study, the pieces had only just begun to fall. Lord Peter Whimsy stood in the doorway of Ashcombe Hollow's study, his lean frame silhouetted against the flicker of gaslight. He turned the freshly delivered note in his gloved hands, a thoughtful frown tugging at the corners of his mouth. The letter bore the same impersonal touch, precise, sterile, and as cold as the grave it claimed to speak from. 3 sentences, not a word wasted, and yet, for all its theatrics, it hinted at something tangible beneath the poetry. Guilt, justice, and now, revenge. Inspector Poirot, sleeves rolled and mustache bristling with the urgency of a man out of his depth, hovered nearby. I'll put someone on the postal staff. See if anyone recalls who dropped it in the box. Might give us a lead. Whimsy nodded, though his attention was already elsewhere. He stared at the corner of the room, specifically, at a faint circular mark on the wooden floor beneath the windowsill. He knelt, pulled a small lens from his pocket, and peered closely. A smear of oil, unremarkable in most homes, but in Ashcombe Hollow, where everything bore the patina of polish and routine, it stood out. Had anyone been in this room recently besides the constable, yourself, and Miss Fielding? No one. Poirot said, we sealed it after you found the second note. Whimsy touched the mark with a handkerchief. Then someone returned, unnoticed. Or we've made a critical assumption that the study is the focus. Perhaps it's not. Perhaps it's merely the stage. Poirot raised an eyebrow. And the performance? A slow one, but deliberate. Miss Fielding entered at that moment, her coat drawn tightly about her shoulders despite the room's warmth. Her eyes flicked to the letter in Whimsy's hand. I suppose it's the last, then? On the contrary, he said gently, I believe we're only midway through the production, and someone is turning pages while the audience stares at the curtain. He looked around the room again, but it was not the grand desk or the carefully curated library that held his gaze. It was the chair, Bexley's reading chair, tucked near the fireplace, its cushions slightly compressed, as if someone had recently sat there for a long while. Miss Fielding, did your uncle keep regular company? She shook her head. None. His only calls were from the delivery boy and once a month, the notary for his will. And yet, Whimsy said, eyes narrowing, someone sat in this chair recently, long enough to leave an impression. But why here, and not at the desk where the letters appeared? Perhaps he read them here, she offered. Or perhaps someone else did. He turned suddenly. Did you ever sit here, Miss Fielding? She blinked, confused. No. Then who did? Poirot stepped forward. We've swept the place, servants, neighbors. The postman doesn't recall anyone new. And your own man's been watching the grounds since the second letter. Whimsy said nothing. He knelt again at the chair and examined the edge, a faint thread, black wool, coarse clung to the fabric. He plucked it, held it to the light. Someone wearing heavy fabric. Not your average postman's flannel. This is tailored, perhaps military, or old-fashioned livery. He looked at Miss Fielding. Did your uncle keep old clothes, uniforms, anything sentimental? She shook her head. No, he detested clutter. Even kept his own law books to a single shelf. Whimsy wandered to the hall and called up the stairs. I should like to see the attic. The attic revealed nothing at first glance. Dust-laden beams, cobwebs, a forgotten trunk or two. But behind a rotting tapestry, he found a curious thing, a hollow in the wall, just large enough to house a person. More curious still, faint scuff, marks along the inner brick and the lingering trace of something sharp, metallic. When he returned downstairs, he said nothing. Instead, he paced slowly, deliberately, until he reached the umbrella stand by the door. There, among the canes and walking sticks, stood a peculiar object, an umbrella with a silver-tipped handle, the kind that hadn't been fashionable since Edwardian times. He pulled it free. The grip bore initials, E.P.G. Edward P. Grayling. He held it out. Miss Fielding, did your uncle ever speak of this? Her hand flew to her mouth. He kept that. After the trial, said it was a reminder. I thought he threw it out years ago, but it's here now. Poirot frowned. Someone brought it back. Or, Whimsy said, someone never left. He turned again to the study, this time to the window. He unlatched it, pushed it open, and leaned out. The ledge was narrow, but below it, the thick ivy crawled up from the garden wall strong enough, perhaps, to bear weight. A skilled man could have climbed this. He murmured, in and out, quietly, leaving no trace except, he turned. To the desk, on the back leg, almost hidden from view, was a nick small, but sharp metal. Whimsy said, from a boot spur, perhaps, or a prosthetic. Poirot finished. Grayling lost part of his foot in the Boer War, didn't he? Exactly. But Grayling's dead. Poirot said, has been for 5 years. Whimsy didn't answer. He simply tapped the umbrella against the floor, listening to the echo of its weight. Later that evening, as the wind howled through Ashcombe Hollow and the fog crept low once more, Whimsy stood at the window, thinking. The notes had come in rhythm, each one closer, more intimate, the tone shifting from ominous to accusatory. They were composed by someone who knew not only Bexley's guilt, but also his mind, someone who had once watched him closely. He turned to Poirot. We need a list of all those present during the Grayling trial, not the officials, the onlookers, family members, anyone who might have nursed a grudge. Grayling had no children, Poirot said, no siblings either. No living ones, Whimsy said. But he had a wife, and she had a sister, Rosalind. Tierney, Miss Fielding said suddenly, from behind. I remember now. Aunt Rosalind mentioned her once. Odd woman. Went to Canada after the trial. They called her mad. Or very patient, Whimsy said. Grief has many faces, and some wear them for decades. The wind rattled the windows again, but this time it sounded like laughter. Not loud, not cruel. Just patient, waiting. The morning after the fog had lifted and the last letter lay quiet in evidence, Lord Peter Whimsy began the slow, surgical process of peeling back the stories people told themselves and others. It started with the obvious. The housekeeper. Mrs. Pettigrew had served Algernon Bexley for 6 years, her loyalty as thick as the starch in her apron. She sat stiffly in the parlor, hands folded, eyes darting toward the study as if the old man might appear there still, thumbing his legal volumes with the same fussy precision he applied to his will. I never saw anything out of place, my lord, she said, voice clipped. Mr. Bexley was strict about order. Breakfast at 8, paper in silence, no visitors but the notary, and that only on the first Friday of each month. Did he ever mention anyone from his past? She hesitated, a flicker, quickly buried. He was a private man, but he did mention a trial once, not in detail, just said some things were best not remembered. That he seemed fearful recently. He seemed angry, my lord. The last few weeks, he took to pacing, started snapping at the radio, as if it had insulted him. And the night before his death, I left at 6. He was in the study. I made his tea tray, left it on the hall table like always. He didn't touch it. Whimsy nodded. And no visitors, none. She hesitated again. Except, yes, well, There was a man, a week before, tall, dark coat. Said he had a message for Mr. Bexley. Wouldn't give a name. I told him to write a letter. What did he say? Nothing. Just smiled. But not kindly. He had a limp. That's what I remember. After she left, Whimsy turned the detail over. A limp. An old umbrella bearing Grayling's initials. A hollow in the attic wall. And now, the hint of an impersonator one playing a ghost with all the rehearsed menace of theater. Miss Fielding returned mid-morning, having made inquiries of her own. She placed a folder on the study table. Her face pale. Tierney's sister, Rosalind. She died in 1910, a year after the trial. But the sister Letitia returned to England in 1915, changed her name, and worked for years in a London sanitarium under the name L. Cray. There's no death record. Just vanished, exactly. Whimsy examined the file. Tierney had been outspoken during the trial. Letters to newspapers, claims of a cover-up, of Grayling's guilt being obvious, but no one listened. Then silence. Poirot joined them. Notes in hand. We've interviewed the neighbors. One, a Mr. Eltham, claims to have seen lights on in the attic 3 nights ago. Interesting. Whimsy murmured. Did he mention telling anyone? He said he thought nothing of it. Just assumed Bexley had hired help again. He had a gardener once. Fired him 2 months ago. Said the man was stealing coal. What was his name? Joseph Cleeve. The name was unfamiliar, but Whimsy made a note. Then he requested Cleeve's address, and within an hour, they were standing before a lopsided cottage 2 miles from Ashcombe. The man who answered was thin, weather-beaten, and spoke in quick, defensive bursts. Didn't do nothing wrong. I told the constable. The old man was cracked. Accused me of pinching logs, then sacks of coal. Fired me without cause. Whimsy offered a thin smile. I'm not here about firewood. I'm more interested in who else might have visited the house recently. Wouldn't know. After he let me go, I stayed clear. But, yes, Cleeve scratched his neck. Saw someone, I think. Few nights back. Long coat. Stood outside. The gate. Just staring. Foggy night. Didn't move for ages. Did he speak? No. Just turned and walked off. Didn't seem right in the head. Whimsy studied him. You never tried to return? Collect wages? Settle the matter? Cleeve's eyes shifted. What's there to settle? He was old and mean. When they left, Poirot muttered, he's lying. Yes, Whimsy said, but not about the visitor. About the grudge. They returned to the village and called on the notary. Mr. Charles Derwent, a large man with soft hands and a courteous smile to smooth by half. His office was neat, but Whimsy's eyes flicked immediately to the photograph on his desk. Bexley and Derwent, standing side by side at a charity luncheon. Derwent, holding a glass of wine. Bexley, unsmiling. Mr. Derwent, Whimsy said. Did Bexley revise his will recently? Derwent nodded. Casual, 3 weeks ago. Added a codicil. Nothing major. May I ask the nature of it? He shifted a minor portion from his niece to a medical charity. Something about redemption. I believe. Interesting. Why redemption? He didn't elaborate. But he said the name Grayling again. Mentioned ghosts. Whimsy kept his tone mild. Did you ever see the letters he received? Only the first. He showed it to me briefly. Odd phrasing. Typewritten. No return address. He seemed frightened. Did you advise him to go to the police? I did. He refused. Said the past was catching up and he deserved no shelter. Later, as they left the notary's office, Whimsy muttered, to calm, to polished. He knows more. Thinks the will's about guilt. Poirot added. But guilt of what? That's what we're not being told. By early evening, the interviews had blurred into a pattern. A man who wanted forgiveness, surrounded by people eager to forget, yet bound to a truth no one dared speak plainly. The contradictions were subtle. Mrs. Pettigrew claimed the study was always locked, yet the gardener knew of a second key. The notary said Bexley was penitent, but Miss Fielding insisted he never spoke of regret. And the man with the limp, the smiling stranger, was seen by 2 people on different nights. One described a black coat, the other a gray scarf. No mention of where he went afterward. It was only when Whimsy returned to Ashcombe Hollow alone that the shape of something began to form. He stood in the study, lights low, and stared at the letters again. 3 in total, each typed with surgical menace. But one word echoed across all of them: you. Not he, not they, always you. Direct, personal. Not a statement for the world, a dialogue, a performance. He walked slowly to the fireplace, picked up the poker, and tapped it against the hearth tiles. Hollow. He pried gently at one. Beneath, a space small, almost trivial. But inside it, wrapped in oilskin, lay a folded piece of paper, ink, not type. He deserved to die, but I could not do it. Someone else did. I watched. I let it happen. Now I wait. No signature. The web was tightening. Voices were speaking, some true, some rehearsed. And somewhere, among the false guilt and real lies, the killer had already confessed. Whimsy simply had to listen more closely. The fire in the study crackled with a low, deliberate hum as Lord Peter Wimsey sat in the old armchair, the ink-written note from beneath the hearth resting in his lap. The handwriting was uneven, but the tremor in the strokes felt less like age and more like inner struggle. A confession penned, not in relief but in torment. He deserved to die, but I could not do it. Someone else did. It was the first true break in the pattern, not performance, but witness. He tapped his fingers against the chair's wooden armrest, mind running through the tangle of voices and faces that had crossed his path. Everyone had spoken of Algernon Bexley with respect or at least restraint, but behind their words had lurked deeper shades: fear in the housekeeper's gaze, bitterness in the gardener's tone, and something unnervingly smooth in the notary's replies. Each had something to gain or protect. Each had their own truth to tell. Poirot entered, shaking rain from his coat. "We trace the umbrella," he said. "It's not Grayling's, not really. Belonged to a James Greer. Decorated. In the Boer War. Lost a leg. Died 3 years ago in Leeds. And the initials? Also EPG, possibly a coincidence. But Greer served in Grayling's unit. We found a photo, both of them, side by side. Greer was Tierney's uncle." Whimsy raised an eyebrow. "So the umbrella's a plant, a symbol. Someone wants us to think Grayling's ghost walks these halls." Poirot frowned. "Then who?" "That," Whimsy said, rising, "is the knot we now unravel." He called for Miss Fielding. She entered hesitantly, her hands pale and tightly clasped. Whimsy gestured to the letter he'd found in the hearth, recognized the handwriting. She took it, read it twice, then slowly nodded. "It's Mrs. Pettigrew's. She used to write the household accounts. I've seen her ledgers, and yet she told us nothing of this. She wouldn't. Not unless," she trailed off, visibly disturbed, "unless she feared something worse." Whimsy crossed to the door. "Inspector, I believe we need a second conversation with the housekeeper." Mrs. Pettigrew did not deny it. She sat at the edge of her chair like a woman awaiting sentence, hands trembling as she looked between Whimsy and Poirot. "I found the man," she said at last, voice hollow. "The one who wrote the first letter. He'd broken in through the back. I chased him off, but not before he dropped the paper. You said nothing of this before." "I feared being blamed. I feared what Mr. Bexley would say if he knew I'd let someone slip past me. But Bexley never knew." Whimsy said gently, "No, I never told him. But later he found the letter. And then the second came, and the third, I think. He believed someone was toying with him. A reckoning." Poirot leaned forward. "Did you know who the man was?" "No, but he had a scar across his cheek, and a limp." Whimsy said nothing. His mind was already drawing lines between Greer's umbrella, Tierney's vanished identity, and this intruder with a scarred face. He thought again of Joseph Cleeve, the gardener with the defensive tone and shifting eyes. But Cleeve, as Poirot had confirmed, had an alibi for the night of Bexley's death. He'd been in the pub until midnight, watched by 3 other men. Still, he knew something. Back in the study, Whimsy laid out the profiles like puzzle pieces. Miss Fielding had motive. She was the primary heir, but her grief seemed genuine, and her knowledge limited. Cleeve had been humiliated and fired, but his resentment lacked the poetry found in the letters. Derwent, the notary, had the steadiest motive of all: financial access, knowledge of Bexley's secrets, and a curious eagerness to frame Bexley's changes to the will as a matter of conscience. He'd claimed to have seen the first letter, but no one else had known of it until Bexley showed him. Then there was Mrs. Pettigrew, the quiet servant who'd seen too much. Her letter beneath the hearth revealed a woman paralyzed by guilt, but still capable of deception. Whimsy scribbled notes, drawing arrows between them all. Greed, revenge, fear. Each motive intersected, but none explained everything. Only when the light faded did a pattern begin to emerge. He rose, returned to the attic. This time, he brought a lantern and examined the hollow more carefully. At the back, half concealed beneath a loose brick, he found something small and metallic. A key. Old-fashioned, ornate, likely fit a cabinet or chest. In Bexley's bedroom, he found the match. The key turned smoothly in a wardrobe drawer, revealing an inner compartment. Inside were documents, legal filings from the Grayling trial, letters from the Tierney family, and one shocking envelope labeled in Bexley's own hand, to be opened upon my death. Whimsy read its contents in silence. Then again, the letter was not a will, but a confession unpublished, unsent. I saw the evidence. I knew the truth. Grayling was innocent. I buried it to protect the Crown's witness. Derwent. He would have fallen, and with him, a dozen cases. I let an innocent man rot for the price of institutional pride. May God damn me accordingly. He returned to the sitting room where Miss Fielding waited. Her eyes widened when she saw his face. My uncle knew, she asked. Yes, and he knew who helped him bury it. Derwent. They summoned the notary. He arrived quickly, his composure intact, but the moment Whimsy presented the confession, something flickered in his expression. Not surprise, resignation. You never meant to kill him, Whimsy said calmly. But you feared exposure. The first letter rattled Bexley. But the second, that was yours. Derwent's voice was quiet. He was unraveling. I tried to keep him calm. You forged one of the letters, Whimsy said, to nudge the guilt along, to control the panic. Derwent didn't deny it. And then the third came from someone else, someone who had found the truth. Poirot stepped forward. Who was it? Whimsy exhaled. That is the final piece we need. The one who delivered the performance, in shadows, not to kill, but to watch a guilty man die of fear. And outside, the fog thickened once more. The motive was no longer singular. It was a maze, revenge built on guilt, lies wrapped in fear, and justice delivered not by the law but by the weight of a conscience left too long untouched. The confession sat like a final stone on a grave, weighty and seemingly conclusive. Inspector. Poirot had wasted no time. Derwent was led out in handcuffs, head bowed, coat flapping behind him like the remnants of respect fleeing into the fog. The newspapers wasted no time either. Lawyers' treachery exposed, Bexley's ghost avenged. The public lapped it up. The notion of a secret buried within the justice system had just the right mix of scandal and closure to lull them into silence. Yet for Lord Peter Whimsy, the sense of completion tasted hollow. He returned alone to Bexley's study that evening. The fire had been extinguished, and the room carried the peculiar stillness of a place recently disturbed. The confession had tied up a number of threads, yes, but not all. There was still the matter of the third letter, the one Derwent hadn't written, the one that had arrived after Bexley was already teetering on collapse. He took the letter from his coat pocket, reading it again in silence. You know what you did. You know who paid the price. The grave in Elmbrook calls to liars. Elmbrook, a minor parish east of Yorkshire. It had never been mentioned by any of the household. Why reference it now? He rang Poirot. Do me a favor, he said. Send a man to Elmbrook. Ask the vicar if there's a grave registered under the name Tierney or a Greer. Poirot grunted. You think we missed something? I think we've been handed a conclusion, Whimsy said, and we're ready to accept it. He didn't sleep that night. Instead, he sifted through everything again, the attic letters, the umbrella, the key in the hearth, the false trails, and Mrs. Pettigrew's scarred intruder, someone with a limp and a knowledge of Bexley's past, someone who had dropped Greer's umbrella not by mistake, but by design. It was past noon the next day when the call came back. No Tierney, Poirot said. But there's a George E. Greer buried in Elmbrook. Died 12 years ago. A daughter still lives near the village. Daughter, Whimsy sat up. He had no daughter listed on his service records. Illegitimate. Never formally recognized, but apparently cared for him until the end. Name? Ellen Greer. She married a school teacher, took the name Ellen Tierney. Whimsy's mind clicked. Miss Fielding's middle name, Ellen. A flicker of breath caught in his chest. He remembered her reaction to the letters. Her mention of tyranny had been too casual, too clean. He thought now of her grief, not the sudden kind, but the long, internal kind one cultivates over years of waiting for someone to finally pay. He returned to the estate that evening, this time with no questions, only presence. She met him at the door, face pale but composed. "I thought it was over," she said softly. He studied her for a moment, then said, "You told me once your mother died when you were young. You said little of your father." She didn't flinch. "I knew the umbrella wasn't Grayling's," she said. "It was my uncle's. He gave it to me before he died, told me to remember what justice looked like and what it didn't. And you chose to remind Bexley," Whimsy said, voice low, "to haunt him. I never meant to kill him," she said, "only to make him see what he'd done. Every time he read a letter, he would stare into the fire for hours. He thought Grayling's ghost had come for him. And the third letter? I wrote it the day before he died. You dropped it into the post." She shook her head. "I gave it to Mrs. Pettigrew. She promised she'd burn it. But I found it unopened in the hearth after his death. She must have thought it too dangerous to leave behind." Whimsy rubbed his brow. "And the performance in the attic, that was Joseph, my uncle's friend. He had no stomach for direct revenge, but he helped me with the effects. The sounds, the footprints." Whimsy sat heavily. "In the nearest chair, you set the stage, but someone else delivered the final act." She looked up sharply. "What do you mean?" "Bexley didn't die from fright. He was smothered, Ellen. A pillow, firm pressure, quick, clean." The blood drained from her face. "I never touched him," she said, eyes wide. "I swear to you I thought he'd taken his own life, or simply stopped." Whimsy believed her. Her fear was not the panic of guilt, but of discovering she'd been playing in shadows darker than she intended. He stood. "Then someone else knew what you were doing and used it. But who?" Whimsy stared at the fire. "Someone who had watched long enough to know Bexley's guilt. Someone who knew you would prepare the stage and stepped in behind the curtain. Derwent was in custody. The world satisfied. The case, as the press called it, had found its villain. And yet," Whimsy picked up the final letter again, holding it to the firelight. The ink had smudged in places, but not from moisture, from sweat, or nervous fingers. He turned it over, then brought out the other for comparison. Something was off. The pressure of the pen, the rhythm. He drew a breath. "One was yours," he said to Miss Fielding, "but the third was not. You may have written the second or even the first, but not this one." Her mouth opened in confusion. "Then who did?" Whimsy turned toward the door. "We've been chasing ghosts," he said, "and now the real hand steps into the light." But the name had not yet risen to the surface of his mind, only a shape, a presence, watching from behind the veil of grief and justice. The killer had waited for the curtain call. And now, with the world distracted by a solved case and a jailed scapegoat, they were free to strike again. Whimsy stared out at the lake, dusk pooling over Yorkshire, the mist curling between hedgerows like memory itself refusing to vanish. He'd told Miss Fielding nothing more, not of the handwriting analysis that unsettled his suspicions, not of the letters, not even the umbrella, which now sat in his study like a silent participant. But something about the scent of those words, the final letter, told him this mystery was deeper than revenge. It was legacy. He returned to London the next morning, retreating into the archives of the Inner Temple and the dusty bowels of the British Library. There was something bothering him, something Bexley had said during a courtroom summation nearly a decade ago, a throwaway remark at the close of a minor fraud trial, one that had slipped unnoticed by everyone in the room except Lord Peter, who had been present to observe a colleague's first appearance at the bar. The phrase returned now with a peculiar clarity. "There's always a family resemblance to a lie." He found the transcript within 2 hours. The case was a small one, Crown versus Templeton and Rook, 1913. Bexley had presided. The defendants were accused of forging war widow pensions, a clever scheme involving phantom relatives and false deaths. Bexley had excoriated them during sentencing, not merely for their deceit, but for their cynical manipulation of the dead. A chill crept into Whimsy's spine. He read further. The names of the defendants stood out. Not Templeton Heed. Died in prison but Rook. First name, Joseph. Whimsy leaned back slowly. Joseph Rook. The same Joseph who had claimed to be a friend of Ellen's uncle. The man who'd helped her stage the attic haunting. He returned to Yorkshire immediately, bypassing the house and heading instead to Mrs. Pettigrew's cottage. She let him in with a look of long-suffering patience. "I told you everything I could," she said, putting the kettle on. "You've already locked the man up, haven't you?" He nodded, but didn't sit. "You mentioned once that Joseph used to bring Miss Fielding small gifts, things from her uncle. Did he ever say how he knew George Greer?" She turned slowly, her eyes narrowing. "Well, he didn't, not directly. But he said he'd known him in London, that they'd served together in some legal capacity." Whimsy said nothing, just waited. Mrs. Pettigrew sighed. "I knew something was strange about him. He never gave a surname, just Joseph. Came every few months, spoke kindly, quiet. But he always avoided the front gate, came around back, like he feared being seen. And he met Bexley, not directly," she said. "But I saw him once in the woods behind the estate, staring up at the windows. I thought he was simply remembering." Whimsy's expression darkened. "He wasn't remembering, Mrs. Pettigrew. He was rehearsing. He left quickly, heart quickening now with the clarity of what had been hidden. This wasn't revenge born in the ashes of justice denied, it was justice manipulated for vengeance. Long nurtured. He found Miss Fielding on the garden path, trimming back dead flowers with mechanical precision. She looked up as he approached, the early chill of evening pinking her cheeks. "There's something I need you to see," he said. He laid the file on the table between them, Bexley's transcript from 1913. Her eyes scanned it, narrowing as she reached the defendant's name, Joseph Rook. She read aloud. "This is the same," he nodded. "Convicted of fraud, served time, disappeared from the legal record after 1918. Changed his name, likely, and found your uncle. He said he'd known my father. He had, as a mark, not a friend. I think he sought out your uncle under the guise of shared hardship. Perhaps they met in some post-war lodging, or through common acquaintances. Either way, he knew Bexley's name long before you did." She paled. "He used me. He needed a stage." Whimsy said, "And you had one." He turned back to the umbrella. "He gave you Greer's things, didn't he? The coat, the letters." She nodded slowly. "He said they were all my uncle had left, that I had a right to them." "And the third letter?" he asked gently. She blinked, mouth parting. "I assumed it was mine. I wrote too. But now that you ask, Joseph offered to send the final one. Said it would be more powerful if it arrived a day late, more haunting." Whimsy breathed deep. "It did, but it wasn't your words it carried." There was silence between them, the quiet recognition of betrayal. She dropped the shears, shoulders stiff. "So he killed Bexley." "I believe so. He knew the time, the mood, the fear you'd ignited. He slipped in behind the mask and ensured the ghost delivered its justice." "But why?" she whispered. "Why kill Bexley after all this time?" Whimsy reached into his coat and withdrew another record one he had retrieved that morning from Elmbrook. "This grave you visited George Greer. He wasn't alone. There was another marker, too weathered for names. But inside the parish records, I found a note. Buried next to Greer is a woman, Margaret Rook, his companion, unmarried. Died 1911. She stiffened. He blamed Bexley. Whimsy said, "Your father was falsely implicated in some wartime legal scandal. He lost everything. The woman Rook's sister perhaps died from illness or despair. I suspect Joseph blamed Bexley for destroying 2 lives." Miss Fielding was silent for a long time. "And now?" she asked finally. Whimsy stood, buttoning his coat. "Now we find him, but the case is closed. For the police, yes, but not for me." She looked up sharply. "He could hurt someone else." Whimsy nodded. "He might already be planning it. He's waited this long. He won't stop at one ghost." As he stepped into the misty garden, the air hung heavier than before. Justice, he thought, had a long shadow, and sometimes it moved long after the gavel had fallen. The evening rain had started again, fine and persistent. As Whimsy sat in the corner of the train carriage returning from a quiet meeting with Chief Inspector Parker, The authorities were satisfied Bexley's killer had been caught. Motive established, case closed, the machinery of justice ever eager for resolution, had already begun turning toward the next crime. But for Lord Peter, the case remained unresolved, the air still thick with unfinished thought. Joseph Rook had vanished the moment his name appeared in that transcript, vanished like a man practiced in vanishing. Miss Fielding's expressions had hardened since the truth, not with guilt, but with the stoic of being manipulated. It was the same expression Whimsy had seen once on a man acquitted of murder, only to discover his solicitor had stolen every penny of his inheritance during the trial. Back in Elmbrook, Whimsy returned not to the Fielding estate, but to the local churchyard. The rain had painted the gravestones darker, their carvings slick and unreadable except by torchlight. He knelt beside George Greer's headstone and the unnamed slab beside it Margaret Rook, whose name lived only in the brittle paper of parish registers. He lingered there in the mud until the hour grew late, trying to feel the shape of Rook's grief, to understand the contour of a vengeance so patient it had waited through war and peace alike. He needed something else, something human. People don't live inside documents or motive maps. They live inside habits, fears, memories. And Joseph Rook had one fatal flaw he liked to observe. 2 days later, a quiet note was printed in the Elmbrook Echo, a short obituary for George Greer, claiming new details had been uncovered about his wartime service, and requesting anyone who knew him to contact Lord Peter Whimsy at the rectory. It was bait, plain and gleaming, and it worked. The man who came to the door 3 evenings later called himself Mr. Telford, middle height, gray hair, and eyes that never quite met yours. He held a walking stick he didn't seem to need and wore boots without a trace of countryside mud. Whimsy welcomed him in without blinking. "You knew my uncle?" asked Miss Fielding, who had agreed to assist in the charade. Her tone was distant, but convincingly vulnerable. Telford smiled with faint sadness. "Only briefly, during the war. He saved my life at Arras. When I saw the obituary, I felt I owed him a debt. I hoped perhaps I might offer a small donation to his grave maintenance." "Kind," Whimsy said, stepping forward with a tray of drinks. "You must be chilled." "Brandy." The man nodded, took the glass with a steady hand. They talked quietly, Miss Fielding asking vague questions about the past. Telford filled in nothing real, no names, no units, just vague recollections. It was too perfect to practice. Then Whimsy said, "It's interesting what war preserves, isn't it?" Telford looked up. "The letter we found in his coat, for instance," Whimsy said, "still sealed, unopened, addressed to someone named Rook." Telford didn't blink. "How strange, stranger still," Whimsy continued lightly, "that the ink on it wasn't made until 1922. Curious, don't you think?" Silence. Telford swirled the brandy in his glass. Miss Fielding shifted. "Do you suppose he kept writing letters after the war, perhaps as a way of—" But Whimsy cut in. "I suppose he might have, but then again, we didn't find any other letters in his belongings. Just that one, with your name on it." A flicker of breath held too long, and I twitched not completed. Whimsy leaned back. "Tell me, Mr. Telford, how would you describe your handwriting?" The question landed with a peculiar weight. Telford smiled. "Unremarkable. I haven't written much in years." "That's lucky," said Whimsy, "because the letter he wrote to Rook matches another letter received not long ago, sent to a judge. Same ink, same pen, same hand." He watched the man's throat move, slow and dry. "We've submitted it to a specialist," Whimsy added. "Graphology's a peculiar science. It's not proof in court, but it's terribly revealing to those who know what to look for, especially when combined with motive and access." Telford's smile had become fixed. "I'm not sure I understand the implication." "Oh, you do," said Whimsy quietly. "You understand it entirely. The letter was the ghost's voice, the ghost you created. You lured Bexley back to his own guilt with it, but you misjudged something." "What's that?" "You believed no one would recognize your voice on the page, but your grief left fingerprints." The man said nothing. Miss Fielding was rigid now, eyes fixed on him with a mixture of disgust and terrible comprehension. Then, softly, Telford laughed. "You can't prove it," he said. "I don't need to," said Whimsy. But the police will. They're already here outside. The crunch of footsteps. Telford didn't move. He seemed older now. His posture slumped. When Parker stepped into the room, the man barely looked up. I only wanted him to know, he said quietly, what it felt like, what he destroyed. Whimsy said nothing as the man was led out, coat damp from the rain, the walking stick forgotten. In the corner, it would all be reconstructed later how Rook had stayed near, used an assumed name, sent the final letter himself, slipped into the estate through the old gardener's trail he'd discovered years ago while visiting. The motive had not changed, only the method. Miss Fielding remained silent for a long time. I feel hollow, she said at last, like something used me and then left. It did, Whimsy said. But you're still here, the shadows. Gone. He picked up the forgotten walking stick. It was lighter than it looked, hollow, even. And inside, carefully concealed in the shaft, he found the final proof, a second copy of the ghost letter, written in the same hand, unconventional, perhaps, but sometimes. Deception only reveals itself when pressed just the right way, and Lord Peter Whimsy, having pressed, knew exactly where the cracks lay waiting. The following morning dawned bleak and sharp, the light struggling through layers of gray as if reluctant to intrude on what had been unearthed. The night before, the mood at the Elmbrook Constabulary was somber, but determined. Joseph Rook alias Telford was in custody, and Chief Inspector Parker had begun piecing together the full extent of his movements. Lord Peter Whimsy, however, wasn't satisfied. Rook had confessed to writing the final letter and orchestrating the confrontation that led to Bexley's death, but he had denied delivering the blow, and the physical evidence, the only object that might confirm the method, remained in Whimsy's possession, the hollow walking stick, or so he thought. By noon, the stick had vanished. It was Parker who broke the news, left it in the evidence locker myself, Peter, catalogued and signed, and now it's gone. No sign of forced entry, no misfiled paperwork. It simply isn't there. Whimsy stared at him, face unreadable. We both know what that means. Parker's expression soured. Someone on the inside, or someone very skilled at looking like they belong, and very certain of what they were after. Whimsy murmured, no rummaging, no mess, just the stick, removed as if it never existed. That afternoon, the station was locked down. Statements were taken, searches conducted. A junior clerk swore he'd seen a man with a police badge enter the archive room around dawn, but couldn't recall the face. The logbook had been tampered with. One name scrawled in a different pen and ink, a detail only Whimsy noticed. It was no longer a matter of proving Rook's guilt. It was about why someone else had interfered. And more troubling still, had Rook acted entirely alone? Whimsy returned to the rectory, a storm growing behind his normally polished demeanor. Miss Fielding awaited him there, seated by the window, her face pale. I heard, she said softly. So did everyone with ears in Elmbrook, he replied. This sort of disappearance tends to rattle more than drawers. Do you think he has an accomplice? I think, said Whimsy, pacing slowly, that Rook's vendetta was personal, but its execution so precise, so time suggests help. Someone who stood to benefit if Bexley fell. Someone who had no sentimental need for revenge, but saw an opportunity in its shadow. Miss Fielding was quiet. Then, my father's will was altered last year. Quietly, Bexley advised him on it. I only learned after he died he'd shifted the bulk of the estate's residuals to a trust. A trust I wasn't aware of. Whimsy turned. Who controls the trust? She hesitated. Mr. George Lavery. He closed his eyes briefly. The family solicitor. He was father's friend since Oxford. He always seemed too obliging, perhaps, but father trusted him, and Bexley's legal manipulations couldn't have happened without Lavery's knowledge. She finished, voice thinned out by nightfall. Whimsy was at Lavery's office. It was a narrow brick building set behind the high street, respectable in its modesty. Lavery met him with forced courtesy, his balding head glistening under the electric light, eyes nervously darting over the sitting room as though expecting company. I heard about Rook, he said. Terrible business, deranged, clearly not so deranged, said Whimsy lightly, that he didn't know how to frame a man with a reputation to lose. Lavery's brow twitched. Frame, oh yes, Whimsy continued, walking slowly past the bookshelves. You see, Bexley was the public target. But it's the aftermath that matters now. The estate, the legal shifts, the vanishing evidence. Lavery stiffened. Are you accusing me of something, Lord Peter? Not yet, said Whimsy. But I do find it curious that a key piece of evidence, an item only someone familiar with its significance would want, disappeared the day after you visited Parker's office for a routine probate matter. I dropped off some documents, indeed, said Whimsy, and curiously, the name in the evidence log matches the alias you used during your brief army service. Frederick L. Ware. I believe you signed it yourself, though the pen was slightly different and the ink fresher than all the rest. Lavery's breath hitched. I imagine, Whimsy added softly, you told yourself it was simply a matter of protecting your firm's name, avoiding scandal, cleaning up after Bexley one last time, or perhaps it was more. Perhaps you stood to gain something if the letter and the stick disappeared. No murder weapon, no direct tie to you, just a madman's confession and a nice clean. Well, Lavery rose, fists clenched. You can't prove anything. Whimsy smiled coldly. I don't need to, not yet. But the walking stick, I know where it is now. You couldn't destroy it, not quickly. You hid it, likely in your safe. And the police, as we speak, are preparing a warrant, which I dare say will be signed before breakfast. He turned, pausing at the door. You've had quite a career, Lavery. But a solicitor's trick has limits, especially when you forget that the dead don't vanish simply because you will them too. The door shut behind him. Back at the rectory, he found Miss Fielding once more, seated by the fire. It's not over, is it? She asked. No, he said, staring into the flames, but we're close. The truth resists burial even when it's buried by those trained to vanish it. And upstairs, in his case notebook, Whimsy wrote a single line under Lavery, buried the stick, buried the motive, but forgot to bury the pattern, and the rain outside kept falling, as if washing the village of Elmbrook clean, though not yet pure. Not quite yet. The storm that had swept over Elmbrook left the village drenched and trembling, the cobbled lanes glossy with rain and whispers alike. Word of George Lavery's arrest spread quickly, though the solicitor had not confessed. The recovery of the walking stick from his personal safe was damning enough for Inspector Parker to hold him overnight. Whimsy, though vindicated in part, remained unsatisfied. The pattern was still blurred. Lavery was cautious, calculating, but hardly the sort to orchestrate such theatrical precision as the anonymous letters and the final blow. Someone else had written the score. It was nearing midnight when a soft knock sounded at the rectory door. Whimsy, still seated at his desk, rose cautiously. Miss Fielding had gone to bed hours before, the exhaustion of revelations weighing heavier than grief. He opened the door to find a local constable, his boots muddy, his breath misting in the cold air. Apologies for the hour, my lord, he said, voice taut. You'd best come. It's Miss Fielding. Whimsy didn't wait for explanation. He was out the door, coat thrown on, cane forgotten. They led him down the lane, past the silent churchyard, and through the hedgerow path to the back of the rectory garden. There, beneath the old yew tree, was a smear of blood on the gravel, and the broken edge of a locket. No body, no signs of a struggle, save for footprints too large to be hers pressed into the wet soil. She had vanished. Inspector Parker arrived minutes later, summoned from the station in a rush of confusion. She wouldn't have gone far. No signs of a vehicle. We've alerted the surrounding farms. She was taken, Whimsy muttered, and deliberately. After all the noise Lavery's arrest caused, someone panicked or struck preemptively. Parker looked grim. A warning? No, Whimsy replied, eyes narrowing. A move, like a rook sliding down the board to cut off a king's flight. Dawn broke as a muted gray band across the sky. The search party fanned out. Whimsy remained in the garden, staring at the broken locket. He knew it well. Miss Fielding wore it daily, a small silver piece containing her father's portrait. Only now it was cracked open, the portrait missing. He returned to the study, heart tight with unease. On his desk, where he'd left it untouched, lay his notebook. And inside, a page had been torn out. Whimsy froze. He had numbered every page methodically, a habit from old investigations. Page 43 was gone, precisely the one he'd begun listing those with knowledge of the letter's delivery. It had included not just Lavery and Rook, but a third name, Merrick, the retired postmaster who now worked evenings at the village inn. Parker confirmed the worst. Merrick's cottage is empty. Been gone since late last night. No note, no luggage. His bicycle's missing. It was too much coincidence. Merrick had no obvious motive, but he had access, a trusted face, invisible through familiarity. Who? Better to intercept or insert a letter unnoticed. The letters, the weapon. The timing, it wasn't Lavery's mind behind the orchestration. It was Merrick's precision. Whimsy's voice dropped to a rasp. Merrick delivered the final letter. But he didn't post it. He placed it by hand. That's how it reached Bexley the morning before his death hours, too early for normal post. Rook might have written the letter, but Merrick planned its rival. He coordinated the performance. Parker rubbed his eyes. So what's his angle? Control, Whimsy said. And perhaps debt. Or fear. Lavery's will manipulation helped someone. Merrick, perhaps, had a secret stake. But now he's in the wind, and he is Miss Fielding. That evening, a letter arrived. Hand-delivered again, this time slipped beneath the rectory door without a sound. Whimsy found it in the hallway, sealed in dark red wax. Inside was a single sentence. She will remain safe if you leave Elmbrook by morning. Beneath it, the missing photograph from the locket. Her father's face, marked with an X across the eyes. Parker was beside himself. He's bluffing. We hold Lavery. Merrick won't act without leverage. He is acting with leverage. Whimsy snapped. And the bluff is that he won't do anything. Merrick's old, but not soft. He knows the law is closing in, and his hand is tightening in desperation. They reviewed every possible hiding place. The abandoned railway tunnels outside the village, the disused bell tower in the old chapel, even the crypt beneath the church. All were empty. But Whimsy kept circling back to one location, the old Fielding orchard. It was sold years ago, Parker said, frowning. Now just overgrown land. No one's used it in decades. But her father used to take her there. Whimsy murmured. She told me once, in passing, they had a treehouse hidden among the oaks. By torchlight, they pushed through the gnarled undergrowth. Thorns snagged at their coats. Owls wheeled silently overhead. And then, nestled between two trees long choked with ivy, they found it, a crooked ladder leading to a wooden platform, half concealed by shadow. They climbed, slowly. Inside, Miss Fielding lay bound but unhurt, eyes wild until they met Whimsy's. Merrick, he asked, untying her. Gone, minutes ago. He heard the rustling in the woods. He said you'd come. No matter what. Whimsy closed his eyes. He knew me too well. And as he led her down, one thought gnawed at him harder than the rest. Merrick had left intentionally. This wasn't flight, it was strategy. A final move before the board tipped completely. Because somewhere in Elmbrook, even with Lavery arrested and Fielding rescued, the game was not over. The letters had stopped, but the author hadn't, and the final signature had not yet been written. The dawn's first light spilled weakly through the mist-shrouded trees as Whimsy and Inspector Parker led Miss Fielding back toward the village. Her hands trembled, not from cold, but from the lingering shock of captivity. Yet there was relief in her eyes and an unspoken resolve that stirred in Whimsy's mind. Merrick's disappearance was no random act of desperation. It was the next move in a carefully choreographed game, and the game was far from over. Back at the rectory, with the morning's pale light brightening the study, Whimsy pored over his notes once more. The case had begun with an impossible crime, a locked room, a dead man, an anonymous letter, and an obscure walking stick that seemed to hold no meaning. Then came the tangled motives, the misleading alibis, and the vanishing evidence. Now, with Merrick vanished and Miss Fielding safe but shaken, the pattern teased at the edges of Whimsy's awareness like a half-remembered melody. He recalled a detail, almost trivial at the time, buried deep in the initial interviews. The mention had slipped past unnoticed, a curious comment from the village postmistress, Mrs. Hensley. She had remarked, in passing, on how Merrick never seemed to throw anything away. Odd little things, she'd said. Bits of paper, scraps from letters, even old stamps. I've seen him pick up rubbish off the street more than once. like he was looking for something. Whimsy had noted the comment, but it felt peripheral until now. He rose and walked toward the mantelpiece, where the faint scent of tobacco lingered, mingling with the cold, dry air. There, beneath a heavy crystal paperweight, was a scrap of torn letter, edges jagged as if ripped hastily. It had been there all along, on his desk, but lost amid the chaos of other documents. He picked it up, studying the faint ink. It was part of a postmark, a partial date, and a fragment of handwriting, almost illegible. His mind clicked. The letters that had terrorized Elmbrook, delivered with calculated timing, had all carried a small mark, a barely perceptible symbol in the lower corner, a delicate swirl like a curling leaf. Whimsy's eyes darted to his own notes, flipping back to the first letter found on Lavery's desk. The swirl was there too, subtly inked into the margin, a memory surfaced from Merrick's interview. The fleeting glance at his notebook, a small book, worn and leather-bound, that Merrick had called his collection. Whimsy had assumed it was a hobby, a harmless eccentricity, but now the pieces aligned. Merrick wasn't just delivering letters, he was cataloging them. Whimsy grabbed his coat. Parker, the key lies in Merrick's collection. We must find it before more disappearances follow. At the inn, the usual hum of village life masked the tension simmering beneath. The landlord, a stout man named Ellis, greeted Whimsy with cautious nods. Haven't seen Merrick since last night. Sir, he left in a hurry, said he had urgent business. Whimsy's gaze swept the dim back room where Merrick had worked evenings. Amongst the clutter, empty beer glasses, faded newspapers, something caught his eye, a small, locked box tucked beneath the counter. Have you seen this before? Whimsy asked. Ellis shook his head. Never. I think Merrick kept it hidden, always secretive about his things. With the landlord's reluctant help, Whimsy pried the box open. Inside lay an assortment of papers, folded letters, postmarks, old envelopes meticulously arranged, and nestled beneath them, a diary. The leather cover was cracked and worn, the pages filled with cramped, precise handwriting. Whimsy began to read. Merrick's journal was a meticulous record of every letter delivered over the past month's dates, recipients, and crucially, annotations next to several entries marked with that curling leaf symbol. One entry stood out. June 14th, letter to Bexley. Delivered personally. Response uncertain. Follow-up necessary. Bexley, the victim's secretary. Whimsy's mind raced. The letters were not just threats. They were part of a dialogue. A manipulation designed to provoke, to unsettle, to test loyalties. But the most revealing passage was near the end. Scrawled hastily, the pattern emerges. They do not see the link, but it is all here. The sequence, the timing. The target's all connected by the unseen thread. Whimsy closed the diary and looked up. The unseen thread, the pattern, it had been under their noses from the start, obscured by the distraction of personalities and motives. He summoned Parker. The letters correspond not only to victims, but to a timeline. Each target was chosen to coincide with an event in the village's past, a betrayal, a loss, a hidden slight. The swirls marked those who knew too much, or who might expose the truth buried beneath years of silence. Parker frowned. So, the villain's playing out some ancient score, targeting people linked by history. Yes, Whimsy said softly. And that brings us to the final piece, the walking stick. It belonged to the village historian, who died suddenly 2 years ago under mysterious circumstances. He was uncovering secrets about a decades-old scandal, financial fraud, cover-ups, and family feuds that reached into every household here. The pattern was a tapestry of revenge woven through time, each letter a stitch pulling loose threads. From the past, the killer's goal was not just to punish the present, but to rewrite history in their favor, silencing those who threatened to unravel the lies. Whimsy paced the room, mind racing through the names: Lavery, the solicitor; Rook, the secretary; Merrick, the postmaster; Fielding, the vicar's daughter. All connected, all pawns or players in a game whose rules were still hidden. He paused suddenly. There was one figure he hadn't fully considered: the new vicar. Himself, recently appointed, outwardly sincere but curiously detached from the village's intimate affairs. Had he been overlooked because he seemed an outsider? or because he was the final piece holding the pattern together? Whimsy's eyes narrowed as the pieces slotted into place. The letters, the victims, the past scandals, they were a smokescreen, masking a deeper, more calculated hand. The game was nearing its climax, and now, more than ever, the smallest detail, the almost invisible swirl, had revealed the shape of the danger. Lurking in plain sight. Wimsey stood in the vestry of St. Albans, his gloved fingers trailing along the edge of a cold stone sill beneath the stained glass window. The morning was sharp, sky-white with overcast, the hush of the church pressing around him like a tomb. Outside, the village stirred to life, blissfully unaware that its darkest sins were slowly unspooling into daylight. The vicar had been called away on an errand, so said the housekeeper, a matronly widow with a habit of appearing and vanishing like smoke. But Whimsy had not come merely to wait. He was here for the ledger, the innocuous, dusty church record that had rested on the lectern since before the war. It was a dull volume on the surface, lists of marriages, deaths, and donations. Yet in the back, in a section long disused, Whimsy had found a hand-scribbled unexedeta not meant for public eyes. He leafed through the final pages, careful not to let them tear. There, pressed between yellowing leaves, he found a series of odd entries, cryptic initials, dates that seemed unlinked to any parish event, and, strikingly, the same curling swirl that had marked the anonymous letters. One name appeared again, and again, always in the margins, always marked with a subtle smear of ink. Wimsey's breath caught. Reuben Cartwright, the former village historian, thought to have died of a stroke 2 years ago, but the notes suggested otherwise. They hinted at a discovery he'd made, something dangerous enough to be hidden, then erased. He snapped the book shut and strode from the church into the gray morning. Parker awaited near the gate, his face drawn and impatient. "I've just returned from Bexley's flat," Parker said. "You were right about the diary." He'd been corresponding with Cartwright before his death. They were tracking financial irregularities tied to the parish trust, old money, hidden accounts, redirected donations, all going back decades. Whimsy nodded grimly, and who oversaw the transition of church finances after Cartwright's death. "The new vicar," Parker said quietly, "Jonathan Arkwright." They exchanged a long look. Arkwright had seemed the least involved of all, too mild, too well-mannered to be anything but harmless. But it was a deliberate pose, a careful mask. And now the motive began to emerge, not one of revenge or greed alone, but something more intimate, more psychological. They arrived at the vicarage to find it deserted. A fire smoldered low in the hearth, but no sign of Arkwright remained save for a teacup, still warm. On the window ledge, Whimsy moved through the house with deliberate speed, Parker close behind. In a locked drawer of the study desk, they found the final piece, a leather folio, identical to Merrick's but far older, and filled not with deliveries, but letters of another sort, confessions, grievances, pleas for guidance, all addressed to Reuben Cartwright, and tucked between them, a single, unsent letter addressed to the Bishop of Oxford, dated the week before Cartwright's death. It was a warning. "I fear I have made an enemy of someone too powerful to name. He is close to close and determined to bury what I've uncovered. The records show misappropriated funds, yes, but also falsified identities. There are things buried in this village, not just in ledgers, but in blood." Whimsy's hands stilled. The truth was blooming now, horrible, intimate, undeniable. Arkwright was not his real name. His birth certificate, which Whimsy had quietly traced earlier in the week, matched no one of that name. Instead, it belonged to a child once adopted by a local family, a boy whose parents had died in scandal, whose father had been publicly disgraced for embezzlement, his name stricken from all church records. The motive, then, was legacy, not revenge, in the vulgar sense, but the meticulous restoration of a name, the unmaking of a shame. Arkwright, if that was his name now, had sought to cleanse the past by manipulating the present. Each target was part of the machinery that had once condemned his father, Lavery, the solicitor who'd signed the forfeiture, Merrick, who delivered the final court notice, Bexley, who acted as clerk for the inquiry, and Cartwright, the man who recorded it all in the church's annals. Whimsy saw it now with the clarity of ice, Arkwright had not just killed to silence, he'd killed to control the narrative, to erase a disgrace that had shaped his very identity, and to ensure no one would ever discover his bloodline. The letters were both mask and mirror, a way to frighten and to judge, each marked with the swirl that his father used in old letters, a quiet signature of rebellion. "Parker," Whimsy said softly, "this is not just about old crimes. It's about inheritance, about shame." He wasn't trying to hide money, he was trying to destroy anyone who remembered who he used to be. And suddenly, Whimsy realized something more chilling. The pattern wasn't done. One final name remained on Cartwright's ledger, Miss Fielding's. Why? Because she had been Cartwright's student, perhaps even his confidant. She might have seen the letters. She might remember the swirl. She had to be removed, not for what she did, but for what she might realize, that the attempt to isolate her. Then her kidnapping hadn't been a mere warning. It had been the beginning of a final erasure. But someone had intervened too soon. Whimsy felt the air shift. He'll try again. Miss Fielding's not safe yet. We must find him before he vanishes like smoke. Parker turned to the door, urgency in every movement. Where would he run? Not far, Whimsy said. He needs the records destroyed, the final ones, and the only full set still untouched is at the Diocesan Archives in Oxford. They would go now, and fast, but even as they departed, Whimsy's mind returned to the man at the center of it all, Jonathan Arkwright, the fabricated priest with a fractured soul. He hadn't wanted money, nor vengeance in blood. He had wanted cleansing, to burn away the stain of his father's disgrace, to ascend not as a fraud, but as a man untainted by history. And in doing so, he had committed the most human of sins, trying to outpace his own shadow. The train to Oxford sped through the frost-bitten countryside, its engine thrumming low like a held breath. Whimsy sat motionless, his eyes on the blurred landscape, fingers lightly drumming the armrest. Parker sat across from him, the folio of damning letters resting in his lap like a loaded pistol. Neither spoke. Words had long been spent. What remained was a silent calculus of inevitability. They reached Oxford by early afternoon and took a hired motorcar straight to the Diocesan Archives, housed in an ivy-clad building behind the cathedral. The archivist, a sharp-eyed woman named Miss Eltham, recognized Whimsy at once and led them to the reading room with no questions. "There was a gentleman here earlier," she added cautiously as she unlocked the heavy door. "Rather nervous. Said he was researching donations from the late 1920s. I found that a bit odd." Whimsy gave a thin smile. "You've quite a nose for trouble, Miss Eltham. Was he alone?" "He said he was expecting a colleague, but I didn't see anyone join him." Parker was already moving down the rows of shelves, silent as a hound. Whimsy followed more slowly, scanning the dim space with narrowed eyes, then a sound paper rustling. A shadow moved near the back corner. Whimsy lifted a hand to halt Parker. "Let me," he mouthed. He stepped carefully round the end of the aisle. Jonathan Arkwright stood by a reading desk, sleeves rolled, his collar askew. His right hand was gloved, and the left gripped a folded sheaf of aged vellum. He looked up at the sound of Whimsy's approach, and for a moment, the air between them trembled with something like recognition to men, scholars in habit, warriors in cause, now adversaries across a fault line that had always existed. "Lord Whimsy," Arkwright said, his voice to calm. "I wondered when you'd arrive. You've been very diligent," Whimsy replied, walking to the opposite side of the desk, meticulous even, and entirely wrong. Arkwright's mouth twitched. "Wrong in thinking you could erase a man's history by destroying others, or rebuild a reputation by murdering truth." "I have done what the church refused to," Arkwright said tightly. "My father was slandered, cast out, broken not for theft, but for knowing too much. He was trying to expose the rot, not profit from it. You've confused martyrdom with murder." "I've corrected history, no," Whimsy said. Softly, "You've written tragedy in your own hand." A beat passed. Arkwright's gaze darted to the folio now tucked beneath Whimsy's arm. His expression shifted, cool detachment cracking at the edges. "I suppose you've brought everything," he said. "Enough. Letters, forged identities, ledger discrepancies. Even the swirling signature, your father's mark, I know about. The parish trust, the falsified records, the misdirected funds. You didn't begin this out of greed, but you ended it in blood. Arkwright's eyes narrowed. You haven't any proof I killed them? Whimsy nodded slowly. Not the kind you'd find on a courtroom floor. No, but Miss Fielding saw you leaving Merrick's study. Bexley's diary mentions a visitor with ink-stained fingers. Cartwright feared you documented your threats in his final letter to the bishop. And Lavery, well, he'd been asking questions about you the week before he was found. Coincidence? Perhaps. Until Miss Fielding described the sound you made when angry. That peculiar whistle. Same one heard near the vicarage the night she was taken. Same as was described by a schoolmate of yours back when you still bore the name Joseph Redding. Arkwright froze. The mask slid lower, and Whimsy saw it the tremor. The silent tightening of the jaw. You don't want a trial, Whimsy said. You want a story. You've built your life around one. A ruined name. A father brought low. You've gone to such lengths to rewrite it, letters, threats, performances. But you've missed the simplest truth. Arkwright's voice came. Like gravel. And what's that? That the past can't be undone by murdering the present. In a sudden movement, Arkwright's hands swept the desk, sending ancient papers flying, and he lunged toward the fire grate. Near the wall, Whimsy moved faster. He caught the fleeing man by the arm, twisting it back as Arkwright struggled. Parker burst in from the aisle, grabbing the other side. The three men wrestled briefly before Arkwright, breathless and snarling, sank to his knees. You think you're clever, he gasped. You think you've won. No, Whimsy replied, kneeling beside him. There are no winners here, only what remains. As Parker secured Arkwright's wrists with a belt, Whimsy looked down at the face before him, flushed, wild, broken. A man who had believed in redemption, who had hoped history could be cut and resewn like cloth. But history, Whimsy knew, was a stubborn stitch. Later, as the constables took Arkwright away, Miss Eltham returned to the reading room with 2 steaming mugs of tea. You've caught your man then? Whimsy nodded, taking a cup. She eyed the scattered papers. Will the story come out? In time, he said, but not as he wrote it. Parker looked up. Do you think he would have stopped if we hadn't intervened? No, Whimsy replied. Not until every name on that ledger had been blotted out. Outside, bells rang from the cathedral tower. Whimsy sipped his tea, watching the shadows lengthen across the archive floor. He thought of letters from the dead to the living, words meant to warn, to haunt, to beg understanding. In the end, perhaps Arkwright had only ever wanted to be heard. The confession had been signed, the culprit removed, and the bitter air of Oxford seemed to soften with the thaw of resolution. Lord Peter Whimsy stood in the vestry of All Saints, where the case had first begun, gazing up at the stained glass glowing dimly in the gray light of early evening. Parker had returned to London with the final report, and Miss Eltham had promised to begin cataloging the salvaged documents by the week's end. The matter, as far as the authorities were concerned, was finished, and yet Whimsy remained still, the silence pressing into him. Something small, a scratch at the back of the mind, refused to be soothed. Arkwright's confession had been thorough, almost a performance tailored for his audience. He had accounted for every act, every death, every deception, as if he'd rehearsed it for years. There had been no pause for doubt, no hesitation, but it was the way he'd described Lavery's death, clinical, without emotion, that lingered like smoke. Whimsy's eyes dropped to the memorial plaque just below the stained glass window. It bore the name of the church's founding vicar, Father Ainsley, long dead, but whose records had mysteriously vanished from the archive room, just as the final pieces of the Arkwright puzzle had come to light. According to Miss Eltham, Arkwright had insisted those early registers were irrelevant. But had they been? A quiet knock on the vestry door broke the stillness. It was Miss Fielding, cheeks pink from the wind, a bundle of envelopes clutched in her hand. I'm sorry to intrude, she said breathlessly, but I found something odd behind the altar, in the cabinet where the old offertory records are kept. I thought you'd want to see it. He took the bundle, untying the frayed ribbon. Inside were 5 letters, yellowed with age but undamaged. He read quickly, heart quickening with each page. They weren't from Arkwright's father, but to him, from someone who had remained unnamed in the investigation, someone who had guided the elder Redding in his schemes. The tone was cool, commanding, instructional. Whimsy's breath stilled. These weren't the writings of a desperate man seeking restitution. These were orders carefully worded, strategic. Always from years in the work. J. No full name, no title. Just that single initial. He scanned the last page, and then it struck him. The distinctive loop on the J. The curved stroke on the final period. He had seen it before, not on Arkwright's confession, nor on the forged accounts, but on a typed note slipped into the archive index weeks earlier. One that had seemed innocuous then, initialed simply J. Missy Lthan. No, not her, but her assistant James Hollier, a mild, bespectacled man with quiet hands and a nervous smile. He had been present the morning Whimsy first arrived, offered tea, helped locate the trust ledgers. Never obtrusive, never forgetful, just enough to be invisible. Whimsy turned to Miss Fielding. "Where's Mr. Hollier?" She blinked. "I saw him not half an hour ago. He said he was stepping out for a late lunch." He handed the letters back to her. "I need to find him." By the time he reached the archive's front hall, the assistant's coat and scarf were gone. A single set of damp footprints led out the main doors, disappearing into the twilight. Whimsy's mind was racing now. If Hollier had been Arkwright's handler, or worse, the original architect of the scheme, then everything Arkwright confessed to had been only half the truth, a cover for someone else. The mastermind hadn't been driven by vengeance or grief. He'd been guided by ambition, institutional power, perhaps even blackmail. He made his way toward the Bodleian, intuition pulling him like a thread. Hollier had once worked there, hadn't he, before moving to the diocesan archives? The change had seemed minor until now. At the entrance, the porter shook his head. "Mr. Hollier?" "No, sir, haven't seen him today. He has a carrel on the upper level, though. You're welcome to check." Whimsy ascended the stairs, footsteps echoing through the cavernous hall. At the far end, tucked between two shelves, was a small desk, neatly arranged books, an ink bottle, and on top an open folder. Inside were correspondence logs, half a dozen envelopes, some stamped with the diocesan seal, others, more concerningly, from the bishop's own office. Wimsey flipped through. One letter, dated 3 months prior, caught his eye. "J. The Lavery situation is becoming unstable. He suspects something. If he speaks to the archivist, everything may unravel. Suggest we take preventive measures. No signature, no letterhead. Just the same clipped phrasing." A rustle behind him made him turn. Hollier stood in the aisle, raincoat damp, umbrella in hand. The smile was gone. "You read them," Hollier said simply. Whimsy gave a slow nod. "You used Arkwright. He wanted justice. I gave him a purpose, and when he became a liability, I let him fall on the sword. You murdered for men. I protected the institution." Whimsy's hand twitched toward his coat pocket. Not for a weapon, he carried none, but for the small signal whistle he sometimes used for Parkers. "Men." Hollier's eyes tracked the movement. "You won't need that," he said. "I'm not running. No." Whimsy's voice was cool. Hollier placed the umbrella against the shelf and stepped forward. "I know the rules. Arkwright was the fire. I was the hand behind the curtain. But if you expose me, the scandal will collapse. More than just a legacy. It will destroy faith. Entire congregations. Are you willing to bear that weight?" Whimsy looked at him long. Then, almost imperceptibly, he smiled. "I bear only the weight of truth. Outside." The bells began to toll again, slow, deliberate. The end of one story, the beginning of another. And beneath it all, Whimsy heard the whisper of something deeper, a truth that could not be silenced, no matter how many letters were burned, names erased, or crimes confessed. Justice, like faith, required light. The silence in the upper gallery of the Bodleian remained heavy long after Hollier had spoken. Lord Peter Whimsy stood with his hands folded neatly behind his back, expression unreadable, as the assistant archivist watched him with a strange mixture of defiance and resignation. Hollier had confessed without fear, without plea, more a declaration than an admission. But now it was the consequences that lingered, waiting to be named. Outside, the rain had returned, whispering against the tall windows like a quiet reckoning. Whimsy moved to the edge of the carrel, glancing again at the open folder of correspondence. With precise care, he closed it and tucked it beneath his arm. Then he turned to Hollier. "You made two mistakes," he said quietly. "You underestimated Arkwright's conscience, and you assumed I was here to protect the institution." Hollier's smile was dry. "You don't believe some things are bigger than one man's guilt, though." "I believe in many things," Whimsy said lightly. "But when a man orchestrates the deaths of four people and manipulates another into murder, I tend to think his sense of moral proportion is a bit unbalanced. You won't keep it quiet." "I most certainly will not." Hollier nodded. Once, slowly, and sat down at the Carol, as though waiting for his fate to arrive like the next volume from the stacks. But fate had other plans. An hour later, when Whimsy returned with two constables, Hollier was gone. The Carol was abandoned, the inkpot knocked over, its dark stains spreading slowly across the desk. A library window at the far end had been forced open. Below it, faint tracks led through the sodden flower bed and vanished into the dusk. Wimsey stared out into the Oxford twilight, the constables already dispersing into the streets beyond. He had half expected this. Hollier had planned it carefully to be taken so easily. And Whimsy had lingered too long with the moral weight of it all. Later, in the drawing room of the rectory, Miss Fielding handed him a fresh cup of tea and sat opposite, her hands tightly clasped. "So he's gone," she said. "Just like that?" "No," Whimsy replied. "Not gone. Delayed. A man like that leaves traces. His habits will surface again, and he's far too meticulous to resist the urge to check, to interfere, or to continue his game somewhere else. But won't he get away with it?" Whimsy leaned back, eyes narrowing slightly in thought. "That depends. Justice doesn't always wear a robe or carry a gavel. Sometimes it waits. And sometimes," he said, glancing toward the embers in the hearth, "it strikes when you least expect it." Miss Fielding hesitated, then asked the question she had clearly been holding back. Why did Arkwright confess to everything, even what he hadn't done? "He believed he was doing the right thing," Whimsy said. "He thought Hollier's work, his noble crusade, was worth protecting. Arkwright wasn't a killer at heart. He was a follower. He needed a purpose, and Hollier gave him one. But when the weight of it became too much, when he saw Lavery's blood on his hands, something broke. Hollier gambled that guilt would keep Arkwright silent. But guilt, Miss Fielding, is a capricious ally." She nodded slowly. "And the other clues?" "The ones we missed," Whimsy smiled faintly. "Do you recall the letter found in Lavery's desk? The one half-burned, unsigned, discussing the risk of exposure?" "Yes." The phrasing matched Hollier's other correspondence perfectly. But more than that, it referenced a meeting. Location, the old vestry ledger room, where Arkwright insisted he had been alone. And yet someone else had been there earlier that same day, Hollier himself, helping to inventory ledgers that never existed. A convenient excuse to place himself in proximity, unnoticed. And the missing records, Hollier had no reason to destroy anything except what linked him to the original diocesan conspiracy. The earliest documents, the founding trust papers, the bishop's personal letters gone. But the catalog entry for them remained, oddly. Why delete the name of a ledger but leave the title listed? Because, subconsciously or not, Hollier wanted someone clever enough to see through the illusion. Miss Fielding leaned forward. "And you did?" Whimsy's smile widened. "Eventually." They sat for a while longer, the warmth of the room doing little to soften the chill of uncertainty that had returned. Hollier was gone. Yes, but he had slipped through Justice's fingers with the ease of someone who had done it before. A week later, the national newspapers ran a small column on page 6. "Assistant Archivist Vanishes Following Oxford Scandal." The article mentioned a potential link to the Lavery affair, but stopped short of naming charges. The church declined to comment. Wimsey read it in silence over breakfast, then folded the paper and returned to his eggs. In the weeks that followed, life in Oxford resumed its steady rhythm. Services were held, documents restored, and the whisper of scandal faded like smoke from the chapel candles. But in a small safe in Lord Peter Wimsey's London flat, beneath a case of rare wine and a bundle of war medals, rested a thin file marked, with the letter J, not as a monument to failure, but as a promise of return. For though justice may have been postponed, It had not been denied. And somewhere beyond the walls of Oxford, in another archive or office or quiet university corner, a man with careful handwriting and cool ambition would feel, for the first time, the breath of pursuit stirring behind him. Lord Peter Wimsey was patient, but he never forgot. The last of the Oxford fog had lifted by mid-morning, leaving the spires dusted in gold and the cobbled lanes washed clean by the night's rain. Lord Peter Wimsey descended the library steps without hurry, his cane tapping lightly with each stride, his hat tilted just enough to shield his eyes from the sharp July sun. A week had passed since Hollier's disappearance. The formal inquiry had concluded with predictable bureaucratic grace, no clear charges, no public admissions. Arkwright remained in custody under the care of a discreet sanatorium near Surrey, his mind fragile but no longer volatile. Miss Fielding had returned to her post, determined to uphold the institution's reputation with renewed vigilance, and Wimsey well. Wimsey had made no promises to stay. As he passed beneath the archway leading to Broad Street, a familiar voice called from behind, "Lord Peter." He turned, offering a genial smile as Inspector Timmins approached. The man was still rumpled as ever, but his gait carried a sharpness absent during the early days of the investigation. "Inspector," Wimsey greeted. "Don't tell me there's another corpse in the Bodleian already." The archive walls barely finished weeping for the last. Timmins gave a dry chuckle. "Not quite. Though I thought you'd want to know we've recovered the missing bishop's ledger. Found it stuffed behind a disused heating grate in the old vestry room." Wimsey's brow lifted, but he said nothing, waiting. "It wasn't damaged," Timmins continued, "but there was something odd about the final pages, a name, added in a different ink, not the bishop's hand. Hollier, no title, no signature, just the name. A last-minute vanity," Wimsey murmured. "Or a hidden boast." Timmins hesitated. "You think he planted it?" "No, he hid it. But the addition was for someone else to find. Me, perhaps, or someone cleverer, in years to come. A historian's calling card. He wanted to be remembered even in disgrace." They stood in silence for a moment, the sounds of bicycles clattering past and a tour guide's distant voice filling the pause. "There's more," Timmins said finally. "A note came to my office. No return address, typed on church letterhead, but old stock. We haven't used that crest since 2014. It read, 'Tell Wimsey to mind the chorister's bell. The tune plays twice. That mean anything to you?'" Wimsey's smile didn't reach his eyes. "Only that Hollier hasn't gone far." Timmins looked uneasy. "We'll keep watch." "No," Wimsey replied gently. "You won't. He won't surface until he's ready." As the inspector left, Wimsey resumed his walk toward the Ashmolean, where an exhibit on medieval marginalia was opening. He was halfway across the square when a low chime echoed faintly St. Mary's chorister bell. He paused. It rang once, then again. The same pattern as ever, and yet, today, it felt pointed. "The tune plays twice." It was the kind of phrase Hollier enjoyed, deliberately cryptic, bordering on theatrical. But Wimsey knew better than to ignore such things. He glanced toward the tower and caught sight of a figure on the upper walkway. Just a glimpse of dark coat, a narrow frame, a hand resting lightly on the stone rail, then gone. A coincidence, perhaps, or a sign. Later that evening, alone in his London flat, Wimsey poured himself a glass of brandy and set the recovered bishop's ledger on his writing desk. He turned to the back, to the ink-smudged name that now seemed to stare back at him like a challenge. Hollier. The page opposite was blank, yet faint indentations marred the surface, as if a page had once lain atop it and been written upon. He fetched a pencil, shaded carefully over the blank sheet, revealing fragments of the ghost text. "St. Just, September 14th. A truth half told breeds its own revenge." JHWIMSEY leaned back, eyes narrowing. St. Just, a remote village in Cornwall, a place Hollier had once mentioned in passing, as the origin of a particular edition of the Apocrypha he'd been cataloging. A truth half told. The case was closed, the deaths explained, the motive unearthed, yet the ledger, the bell, the message, they spoke of something unfinished. He looked toward the fire, where the last of the coals glowed a quiet red. Mysteries, he thought. did not end when the villain fled or the confession was signed. They rippled outward, weaving into other lives, waiting to be unearthed again by accident or design. He closed the ledger softly, sealing the message beneath its covered dot in the corner of the study. Bunter stepped forward silently, placing another log on the fire. "Going out again, my lord?" he asked. Wimsey stood, shrugging on his coat. "Possibly. It seems Hollier has left a trail of breadcrumbs. One might be inclined to follow them." Bunter gave a small nod. "The car is ready." Wimsey paused by the door, his hand on the knob. Then he smiled faintly and glanced back over his shoulder. "A chorister's bell, Bunter. Twice rung. We'd better not keep the encore waiting." And with that, he disappeared into the London mist, the mystery far from over.